Okay, we come back to this photograph or this picture, this image. And there's some interesting things happening here. I have kind of in passing mentioned flat roof construction. Maybe I should have mentioned it more specifically, but there was a tradition. There were these two parallel traditions. Either the flat roof or the pitched thatched roof. And this picture this sketch of 1812 shows exactly that. I mean, if you see the first little building over here, the first two buildings are flat roof buildings. And then thatched roof, by and large, gabled buildings. But there are little flat roof buildings as well. There's one right there as well, which is quite interesting because I think people kind of have the idea that flat roof may be more, not as contemporary or not, a parallel kind of construction method. So the other interesting thing is you can see the church. That would be the first church on that site at the head of the street. Okay, there's the plan of Graaff Reinet, more or less that time, 1814. The upper one is just extract, the bottom one is the entire plan. So you can see the town wasn't laid out fully at that period. Essentially, it considered of Church Street and Parsonage Street, in effect. Okay, that's a very famous map, Thompson's map of 1823. And it's actually quite staggering, the kind of development that took place from 1804 or 1814 to 1823. By 1823, the whole town had been set out. And I mean, I think there we have probably Andre Stockenstrom to thank for that. And the expansion of the water irrigation system. That's what Church Street looked like. Now, in the construction actually underwent a fair revolution in the middle of the 19th century, middle to late 19th century. And there we crossed another threshold. And there you could say it's a threshold from pre-industrial vernacular to post-industrial vernacular. Post-industrial vernacular becomes far more complex to actually try, even attempt to explain. But pre-industrial vernacular is exactly that, using materials that were available to you in the pre-industrial period. Now, one thinks that the Industrial Revolution in Europe and America had very little to do with South Africa. But it actually didn't. It had a massive influence. And certain materials that came in had a significant impact on architecture at the time, and even to today. It's changed the whole feel and aesthetic of Graaff Reinet. If you look at this picture, it's also a famous extract from the famous panorama that William Rowe took in 1860 from the tower of the Dutch Reformed Church then, looking down Church Street. I mean, look at all those buildings. They're all kind of thatched, mainly thatched, probably 70% thatched buildings. But you can also see, and this would be the advertiser building, the old advertiser building where Sief is now. There's a flat roof building. It was a Braakdak. As I said earlier, I should have mentioned that parallel kind of technology earlier. But there was always the technology of Braakdak as well, from the earliest time. And it was traditionally a mud roof on heavy beams with reeds and then mud. And the technology behind it was that if it rained, well, it's mud, it's puddled clay, it's clay. So when it rained, the clay that's the theory behind it. When it rained, the clay expanded and all the cracks sealed up and it was rendered relatively waterproof. That's the theory. I think in practice it was a bit of a disaster. To our standards anyway. Maybe it didn't leak quite like a sieve, but it probably did leak in certain areas. And then there was a more sophisticated variant. I do have pictures of that, I'll just as a matter of interest, where it was actually a lime roof. I'll show you that a bit later. Okay, so what I'm saying is that there was another threshold, and I say 1860 probably, when there was a massive influx of industrially produced material. And here we're kind of talking about corrugated iron, even timbers. We're talking about stuff that wasn't commonly available, standardized Oregon pine timber from America, in standard sections, 3x9s or whatever that one traditionally speaks about. So that changed things dramatically. And so one finds then that firstly the thatched roofs were replaced by corrugated iron, 90%. In fact, I don't think, probably 100%. I think the thatched roofs that we now have in Graaff Reinet are all restorations. I don't think any survived till probably the last lot were probably in the 1920s or something. And then the availability of timbers and longer timbers enabled the proliferation of flat roof construction that was waterproof, or far more waterproof than a Vernacular. So I think that is when flat roof construction really, when people talk about the Karoo style, I think that is really when the Karoo style took off. And you'll see most of these little towns around Graaff Reinet date more or less that time, like Victoria West, Richmond's a bit earlier. But where flat roof construction actually is the majority almost of houses are flat roof construction. And I think that is because of corrugated iron. It was far easier to build a flat roof with corrugated iron.
When was that introduced roughly? Corrugated iron?
1858, around 1858. That's the first record that I have of corrugated, found, maybe earlier, I'm not sure. But the earliest record I have found of corrugated iron in Graaff Reinet was an advertisement placed by Bolus, I think, for sale of corrugated iron and sheet lengths, etc., that he could sell or had available. And obviously in later times, things like fretwork verandas, cranked corrugated iron, I'm sure that stuff was all, I don't think much of it was locally made. I'm sure a lot of it was imported from America, particularly. So yeah, that changed everything. So the Graaff Reinet as you see it today, what I'm really getting at is a layer upon layer upon layer of changes that have taken place over time. And that is probably the honest way of looking at architecture. One doesn't want to restore everything to what it used to look like, because I don't think one really knows what it used to look like, firstly. But one must accept that there is a layering over time, and some of the layers are maybe not that great, but a lot of them are actually have a function, and do actually add to the building itself and to the townscape. One further thing I may want to add to vernacular. I did mention it earlier, vernacular architecture. It was, and this is where the social aspect comes in, because I say it's a multifaceted thing. Vernacular building relates it's not only a building, it doesn't only relate to the actual act of construction and building, it relates to how one relates to one's entire urban environment as well. It was all according to some kind of system in pure vernacular. Say if you look at a village in England or a village in Italy or something, that village is a reflection of how people lived. Not only the house gives you a reflection, but the whole settlement gives you a reflection of how people lived. For instance, in Italy, people didn't entertain in their homes. They met their friends in the piazza. So the house was designed around that. It was a family thing, but you entertain, but there was space for you to entertain and to socialize, and that was outside. And obviously the climate also lent itself to that type of way of life. So it's, and every kind of traditional society, vernacular society, reflects the same thing. Everything was part of a whole, and that's something we've lost as well. Everything has become specialized, fragmented, and I think that's the reason why we've got codes of practice, building regulations, zoning schemes, because what was assumed in the past everybody knew how they had to act to be considerate of their neighbours and to recognise the social context. We don't have that anymore. I mean, if I want to build a brewery next to somebody's house, you know, obviously you have to go through, it's not the right thing to do, but you may want to do it. But you have to go through the municipality, you know, health regulations, building regulations, zoning schemes. So I mean, we wouldn't have contemplated something ridiculous like that in the past. But I mean, yeah, today you need those kind of controls because people have become kind of independent-minded, more independent-minded.
So you spoke about the Italian lifestyle. So what would have been the equivalent in Graaff Reinet of people how they would have lived?
Well, you would have lived on your stoop. It's probably less pronounced in Graaff Reinet because Graaff Reinet isn't really in its entirety a vernacular settlement because it is kind of planned in a way. It is planned, but it's still the buildings still reflect the kind of the use of the stoop. You probably did entertain in the evenings. You sat on the stoop and then you could socialise. People walked past and so on. So yeah, maybe not quite as obvious as it would be in a typical wholly vernacular kind of settlement, which Graaff Reinet isn't really. You may find that more in, say, in Umazazaki, for instance, which is actually almost entirely a vernacular settlement. Yeah, but that's another field entirely, so we don't want to speak on without looking at it more. I just want to show you the Verandah. Okay, this, and you'll know. I mean, I think you saw it. I think you climbed up the ladder, but this is 14 Parsons Street, across the road here. So we had to replace the corrugated iron roof because you can see it's pretty rotten. It's rusted and everything. So when we lifted the corrugated iron, we found this kind of. The purlins were laid on top of another structure. They're not tied to the actual roof structure as they would normally be, to timbers. And when the whole roof was off, this is what was exposed. So that is an old Verandah. That is actually what the roof would have. Obviously, it would have looked better than when it was still in use as an actual roof. But that is what the surface of the roof was. I'll show you now. But it's laid to falls. You can actually see it. It makes little ridge at the in the middle, and it actually channels a bit, and then it comes down to the back. There you can get an idea what the construction is. So basically it's a timber deck. On top of the timber deck are bricks laid out, probably a bit of mortar with bricks laid out on it. And on top of that is lime plaster. And it's obviously then screeded to fall, and it falls to the back. So you can imagine that wasn't a very kind of greatly waterproof solution to a problem. But I mean, it was what they had to use up until the advent of corrugated iron. This actually, interestingly, you've probably heard accounts. Cape Town was because in the beginning, Cape Town was almost an entirely thatched settlement, and it was ravaged by fire on numerous occasions. Because you can imagine if one building catches alight and there's a howling gale, that fire just spreads. And an ordinance was passed that thatched roof would be outlawed, and you had to build a flat roof. And that accounts for, that's early on already, and that accounts for people, houses like Koopmans de Wet. There are many of them in Cape Town. That are early structures, but they are flat roofed. And they were built with this in a similar fashion. And there are accounts of early travellers coming to Cape Town, and there's this kind of stench hanging in the air. Because what they did to render these roofs waterproof was they used whale oil. And they coated the roofs with whale fat or whale oil to render them a bit more waterproof. So you can imagine that was probably not. They didn't have kind of all the fancy kind of bituminous things that we have today that you could waterproof things with. So yeah, that's just an aside, interesting aside.
When was concrete
With Portland cement, well, the Romans used concrete. Depends what but there's interesting geological reasons for that. I think that the material that they used was called porcelain. It's a volcanic stone that they used that actually had the same properties as cement, Portland cement we'd have today. In other words, it hardens in water. It's what do you call that? I can't think of the word now. Yeah, it actually cures in water. So that's why you keep concrete wet, because it actually cures and hardens in water. And Portland cement does that. The Roman cement that they used did that. That's why they could also do fancy things like building the Pantheon and building the Colosseum and all of that. That is in the core of that is actually Roman concrete. It's just faced in stone, but the actual structure is concrete, Roman concrete. Now, Portland cement is limestone that has undergone certain treatments. I mean, Bruce, you may know what the chemistry, the geology of the whole thing is, but yeah, but it actually the process that it undergoes of burning, etc., actually renders it, gives it chemical properties that it hardens under water or in water. But when it came in, Portland cement it's not that early. In South Africa, Portland cement is not that early. Probably Johannes will probably know.
I think the first mention of cement in Graaff Reinet was when they built the canals.
Okay.
1884.
Graaff Reinet was fortunate that it had a good source of lime, of very good lime, and that was from Kalkopi, which was subsequently, very recently, I think, identified as an impact crater that had over the years become filled with water, and then obviously the marine or aquatic organisms that lived in there kind of settled all in the bottom and it turned into limestone. I actually have a sample I could have brought with. But it's a very pure limestone. It's white, pure white. It has very little impurities in it. And what they did was they actually could make lime for building purposes. There's a whole chemical process involved there. So I think limestone is like shells. They burn shells for lime as well, but not obviously along the sea. It's calcium carbonate, basically. The composition of limestone and seashells, and they burnt it, and then it turns into calcium. Burn it at 900 minimum 900 degrees Celsius, and it changes in chemical composition. It becomes calcium oxide, and then it's hydrated. In other words, when it's cooled down and it's heated up or whatever, and it's water is applied to it, and then it once again changes in chemical composition, and then it becomes calcium hydroxide. And that is what the hydrated lime, and you can buy it today in the shops, hydrated lime. That is the lime that you would use for construction. And that was done in those days. It was definitely done. Because there's an advertisement that I found in the Graaff Reinet Herald, advertisement for Boodle River lime. When they were building calling for tenders for Boodle River lime, and that's when they were building the prison in 1854, I think. So it was used, definitely.
It's because it was probably before dynamite. Make fires and then throw cold water.
Yeah.
Much like Thomas Bay and
Yes.
enabled all those passes.
Yeah.
But somehow they got the stones to break in triangles so
Mm.
that they could shore up the road. And they got them to break in triangles that they could put one this way, one that way. So maybe there was a way to get them to break
Yeah.
in squares.
No, that's quite possible. That is quite possible. But I think stone kind of fractures on certain at certain lines.
How they got them
Yes.
to break in
Yeah.
triangles.
Because even now, if you look at stone, it's in strata in the environment. You can actually see where people have taken stone out sometime. Because we had an interesting, Bruce was involved in. Remember, we went to look for where they quarried stone for the church, for the Anglican church, and it's still a riddle today. But I think it would appear that it could have been quarried on the Mountain Drive area, because there are clearly places where people have worked there, have taken stones out.
Sorry, I just have a question. Can you speak a bit about the profiles of the stoep roofs, the east profile and the three profile?
Sorry, the what? Okay, the profiles of the stoep roof. Yes, the earliest one will be the concave profile. That came in around this 1860s probably, 1860s, 1870s. Then you get the OG profile, which is called the Bell profile. It's a double curve, concave and then convex. And then you get the bullnose profile, which is the most recent profile. 1910 on probably. It's a simple, at the eaves it makes a curve, otherwise it's straight. And that would be the bullnose. Those are the three common ones. I don't know, did that answer your question? Obviously that was done by machine. I think a lot of that stuff, it could have been rolled in South Africa as well, because there were people like Mangold in PE and so on, that could have been rolled locally. The sheets came out as straight, but it could also equally have been curved when it arrived in South Africa.